True Blue Hero, written and told by Kiefer Adams. Basil, the diesel-powered tender engine, had been invited back once again to the island of Sodor. But this time he was not needed for an emergency. He had actually come to the island to help out one of the Fat Controller's engines, and it was actually Edward. Over the last couple of weeks, Edward had not been feeling well. His joints creaked, he couldn't breathe properly, and the Fat Controller was deeply worried. As he usually did, Basil was more than happy to offer his services and was on Sodor for a few days to help Edward as best he could. Basil was always a welcome visitor to the Fat Controller's railway. Even in his new striking blue coat that he had received after his last visit, Basil felt just as useful as he had been before. "Maybe you should take a couple of days off work, Edward," suggested Toby one morning. "You're not looking well today." "I can manage," said Edward. "I've gone through tougher things than this." "Yes, Edward, but you look quite pale," said Gordon. "Maybe it's best Basil does your work while you rest at the works." "I know you're both looking out for me," said Edward, "and so are the others. But I never back down from hard work. You know that." "All we're saying, Edward," cautioned Toby, "is to take it easy. That's why Basil's here. You know he's helped us out loads of times before." "I know," said Edward. "We'll see how it goes." Edward clanked away from the yards. "He really needs to take it easy," said Gordon. "Do you know he and James have coal to deliver today?" "I know," said Toby. "So many trucks will be too much for Edward, but we'll see how Basil can help." Gordon humbly agreed. Basil was already at the coaling plant when James and Edward arrived. James would usually tease Edward about his performance, but even he was starting to get worried. "Maybe I should take your train for you," he suggested. "No, it's fine," wheezed Edward. "I can do this." "Are you sure?" called Basil from nearby. "We don't want you straining yourself, Edward." "Don't worry about me," Edward said. "I've done a lot worse in my time." And Edward clanked away to his trucks. As James watched, he couldn't help but notice that Basil was looking a little unwell too. "Don't tell me you'll be needing our help as well?" he asked. "Oh, no, not at all," replied Basil. "I'm sure I'll be all right. I've dealt with tougher things myself. All Edward needs is a bit of a helping buffer, that's all." Basil rumbled away, leaving James feeling rather concerned. Before long, Edward and Basil were coupled up to a long line of heavy coal trucks which were going to be delivered across the island. Once everything was ready, the two engines set off. At first, all went well. For the most part, Edward had a good head of steam and was doing well. Basil was too. But soon there was trouble. They were just passing a signal box when Edward was surprised to hear Basil honking his horn rather loudly. "Stop!" he groaned. "I need to stop!" Edward was surprised, but soon they brought the whole train to a complete standstill. Edward's driver came to see Basil's. "What's happened?" he asked. "I don't know," replied the driver. But they soon found out. "Well, that's torn it," said Basil's second man. "Basil must have taken on bad fuel. I told the manager on the mainland that the kerosene was playing up." "I'm so sorry," whimpered Basil. "You shouldn't be sorry," said Edward. "It happens to the best of us." "But what can we do now?" asked Basil. "We're both unwell and stuck in the middle of nowhere." Edward began to ponder the situation. "Do you think we can get Basil to the next station?" Edward asked his crew. "It's worth a try," said his fireman, "but don't strain yourself." "I've got this," said Edward. "Basil's helped us many times. Now it seems only fair that we help him." "Oh, thank you, Edward," said Basil weakly. When everything was ready, Edward used every ounce of strength and steam that he had and began pushing his weight against Basil. He was heavy, but Edward was determined. "Come on, come on, come on," he puffed. "You've got this, Edward, you can do it," shouted Basil. He now knew how Derek had felt when he had helped the failed diesel during a previous visit. Edward pushed and puffed so hard his cheeks were soon as red as his butterbean. The next station thankfully came into view. Henry was waiting in a siding. When he was explained the situation, he was more than happy to take Basil to the works. Edward did what he could to deliver his trucks, but even he couldn't get as far as his own station. He was uncoupled from the train, and another engine was called to come and take him to the works as well. A few days later, Thomas arrived at the workshops and found Basil in a siding, feeling much better. "How are you feeling?" he asked. "Very good," replied Basil. "The Fat Controller kindly sent me a fresh tank of kerosene. I feel 10 times better." "You're not the only one," said Thomas. "Are you, Edward?" Basil gave a big smile when Edward puffed into view. He was looking a lot healthier. He had a big smile on his face and his steam was white and feathery. The Fat Controller also arrived. "How are you feeling, Edward?" he asked. "Oh, like a new engine all over again," puffed Edward. "Thank you, sir." "Thank you indeed," said Basil. "Don't thank me, Basil," said the Fat Controller. "You two worked very hard, and I'm incredibly proud of you." "Sir," said Basil, I'm sorry to tell you this, but this will be my last visit to Sodor, but I'll never forget everything you've done for me. And you, Edward." The Fat Controller smiled. "I know, Basil. Your manager phoned me while you were at the works. I want you to know, as I once said to you before, you might not be one of my engines, but if you ever need a place to call home, Sodor will always welcome you." "Hear, hear," agreed Edward. The engines all smiled gratefully. When Basil did return to the other railway, the engines were saddened that it would be the last time they'd see him. But they would never forget the kindness, generosity, and supportive heroism that came from Basil, the diesel-powered tender engine.